So I recently went through something that most people wouldn't believe unless they saw it with their own eyes. A story about land, about pride, about family history, and about what happens when powerful people decide they can walk right through you and through everything you've built. The morning it all began, the ranch was quiet like it had been for 150 years. My family had raised cattle on that soil, fixed fences along that dusty ridge, and buried more than a few dreams under those cottonwoods. To me, it wasn't just land. It was the last living heartbeat of a legacy. But to them, the suits, the contractors, the county men with their polished shoes, it was just a shortcut, a straight line for a road that didn't care what it cut through. I remember standing at the gate when the survey trucks pulled in, their orange vests flashing like intruders on sacred ground. My gut twisted because deep down I knew, once their boots touched my dirt, they'd never leave empty-handed. Still, I tried to reason. I asked questions. Why here? Why my land? There's 100 other routes. But they didn't even look me in the eye. One of them smirked and said, because this is the easiest way. Easiest for them, hardest for me. That night I sat on the porch staring out at the fields. The wind carried the smell of cedar, the same scent I'd grown up with since I was a boy. And I couldn't shake the thought, how do you fight a system that doesn't see you? How do you make them understand that dirt isn't just dirt when it holds your family's story? But maybe the strangest part, the part that still makes my chest tighten, is how quickly they moved. Within a week, machinery rolled in like an army, bulldozers, graders, trucks bigger than anything I'd ever seen. The rumble of their engines shook the windows of my old ranch house. And as I stood there helpless, I felt something break inside me. They weren't just building a road. They were erasing me one scrape of metal at a time. Neighbors whispered that I should let it go. You can't fight the county, they said. They'll bury you in legal papers before you even get your boots on. But I wasn't raised to back down. My grandfather once told me, land isn't borrowed, it's guarded. Those words echoed louder than the machines outside my fence. So I made a choice. I chained the gate shut. I parked my old truck across the entrance, and when the foreman came storming up with his clipboard, I stood my ground. My hands were shaking, but my voice didn't waver. You're not crossing this line, I told him. The look in his eyes, I'll never forget it. He wasn't angry, he wasn't even surprised. He just looked amused, like I was a child playing sheriff in a ghost town, and in that moment I realized something chilling. This was just the opening move. Because within days, I wasn't the one pointing fingers. I was the one being sued. The papers came in a thick white envelope, dropped at my doorstep like a death sentence. They accused me of obstruction, of interfering with lawful construction. Imagine that. They built a road straight through my 150-year-old ranch, and somehow I was the criminal for trying to stop them. I sat at my kitchen table staring at those pages, my coffee turning cold beside me. Rage burned in my chest, but underneath it was something worse. Fear. Fear that no matter how much I fought, they had already decided how this story would end. But here's what they didn't know. That ranch wasn't just land. It was memory, it was bloodline, it was my grandfather's calloused hands and my father's broken back. And I wasn't about to let them erase that without a fight. The question was, how far would I be willing to go? They thought the lawsuit would scare me into silence, that I'd fold under the weight of paperwork, legal threats, and the endless grind of courtrooms. But fear has a way of changing shape. At first, it had me lying awake at night, listening to the creak of the old house, wondering if I'd lose everything. Then slowly it hardened into something else, something closer to resolve. The morning after I got served, I drove into town. The streets were buzzing with Friday chatter, kids walking out of the diner with milkshakes, ranchers tipping hats on Maine. But when I walked into the county courthouse carrying those papers, it felt like I was stepping into a different world entirely. A place where men in suits spoke in codes, where everything came down to signatures, seals, and who had more money in their pocket. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced at me. "Oh, you're the road case," she muttered. Just like that, I wasn't a man anymore. I was a case, a problem on a desk. My jaw tightened as she slid the documents back across the counter. What stung the most wasn't the lawsuit itself. It was the realization that they'd already stripped me of my voice before I ever had a chance to speak. I remember walking out of that courthouse with the sun blinding me. People passed by, busy with their lives, not knowing that a man's world was being carved apart a few blocks away. And I thought, is this what happens when you stand up for yourself? They don't just push you down, they bury you alive in red tape. Back at the ranch, the machines hadn't stopped. They worked like ants, carving through hillsides, slicing across pastures where my cattle once grazed. I stood at the fence and watched as a century of untouched earth was stripped bare in hours. Every scoop of dirt thrown aside felt like a page of my family's history being torn out and burned. My neighbors stayed quiet, some out of fear, others because they didn't want to pick a side. But one old friend, Mr. Alvarez, who'd lived on the adjoining property for decades, came over one evening. He leaned on my porch rail, his hat pulled low, and he said quietly, "They'll come after your money first, then your pride. Don't let them take both." Those words stuck with me, because pride was all I had left. Weeks passed and the case wound its way through the system. Their lawyers argued I was interfering with progress. Progress. That word burned in my ears. To them, progress meant a road that would shave 10 minutes off a commute. To me, it meant the destruction of a home older than their entire county building. The first hearing was a blur of polished shoes and cold stares. I sat alone at the defendant's table, my boots scuffed from ranch work, my hands calloused from barbed wire and fence posts. Across from me, their lawyers whispered to each other, their suits pressed sharp enough to cut glass. And as the judge read out the charges, I felt small, smaller than I'd ever felt before. But here's the strange thing. Sometimes being underestimated lights a fire you didn't know you had. I found myself standing straighter, meeting their eyes, refusing to bow. They could drag me into courtrooms, but they couldn't drag the ranch out of my blood. After the hearing, as I drove home, a storm was rolling in. Dark clouds swallowed the horizon and lightning split the sky over the ridge. It felt like nature itself was mirroring what was happening, something ancient colliding with something careless, violent. That night, rain hammered the tin roof of my ranch house. I lay awake, listening, and I swore to myself that no matter how long it took, I'd fight this with everything I had left. The fight, though, was lonelier than I ever imagined. Friends stopped visiting. Family told me maybe it was time to move on. "Sell what's left," one cousin suggested. "Start fresh somewhere new." But they didn't understand. You can't start fresh when your roots run 6 generations deep. And then came the real gut punch. One morning, I opened my mailbox to find another letter, not from the county this time, but from the bank. A notice of pending foreclosure. It seemed the county had filed liens, penalties stacking on top of legal fees, interest piling faster than I could pay. In black and white, they were telling me what they hadn't had the nerve to say to my face. "We're going to take this land one way or another." I remember sinking into the old wooden chair in my kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand. For the first time, I felt the weight of true defeat pressing on my shoulders. What if they were right? What if I couldn't win? But then my eyes landed on a photograph hanging above the table. My grandfather standing in front of this very house, his face hard as stone, his hand resting on the rifle he carried through harder times than mine. The caption written on the back of that photo echoed in my mind. "Don't let them take what you guard." I folded the bank's letter and set it aside. My pulse steadied. I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. If they wanted a fight, I was finally ready to give them one. The first time I truly realized how stacked the deck was against me, it wasn't in a courtroom or in some county office. It was right there at my gate when 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up in their cruiser. Their headlights cut across the gravel drive, and I stepped out onto the porch, heart pounding. One of them, a younger guy with a nervous smile, shifted uncomfortably as he held out a folded notice. "Sir," he said, "we've been instructed to deliver this injunction. You're ordered to remove any obstructions preventing road construction. Failure to comply could lead to arrest." Arrest, the word hit me harder than any lawsuit or bank notice had. For a moment, I saw myself behind bars, the ranch abandoned, bulldozers tearing through without anyone left to stop them. The older deputy, though, kept his eyes locked on me. Not unkind, but firm. Like he was silently telling me not to make this harder than it already was. I took the paper, signed for it, and watched them drive away. The gravel crackled under their tires, and when the dust settled, I felt like the world had shifted again. I wasn't just fighting a lawsuit anymore. I was now one step away from losing my freedom. That night, I sat in the dark living room, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. My hand brushed over the old family Bible on the coffee table. I remembered my grandmother's voice, steady as stone. "Evil doesn't always come in the night, child. Sometimes it comes dressed in daylight, carrying papers." I whispered to the empty room, "What would you do, Grandpa?" But the silence that followed was heavier than any answer. By morning, I knew I had to act. Letting fear paralyze me wasn't an option. I needed help, real help. Not sympathetic neighbors or whispered advice, but someone who could stand toe-to-toe with the county's lawyers. So I drove 2 towns over to meet with a man whose name I'd only heard in hushed tones, Thomas Kincaid, an attorney known for taking on cases no one else dared touch. His office was nothing like I expected. No polished marble floors, no glossy plaques. Just a cramped room stacked high with books, papers spilling across his desk. He looked up over his glasses, sizing me up like he'd already read my entire story on my face. "You're the rancher they're suing," he said flatly. "I'm the man they're trying to erase," I shot back. For a long moment he just studied me. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "They've been doing this for years. Eminent domain. They hide behind that phrase like it's a shield. But sometimes, just sometimes, they overstep." Hope flickered in my chest. "So you'll take my case?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "I'll warn you now, they'll drag this out. They'll bleed you dry if they can, but if you're willing to fight, I'll stand with you." That was all I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't standing alone on that battlefield. The next few months blurred into a storm of hearings, filings, counterfilings. I learned to sit still in courtrooms while they painted me as a stubborn old fool blocking progress. Their lawyers sneered, waving maps and charts like they were gospel. But Kincaid fought back with quiet precision, picking apart their claims piece by piece. The county argued that the road was for public good. But Kincaid pressed them hard, exposing how the real plan wasn't about helping commuters. It was about opening land for developers. Profits dressed up as progress. The courtroom shifted that day, whispers spreading as the truth cracked through their polished facade. Still, every victory came at a cost. My savings drained faster than water through a sieve. Letters from the bank piled up. Each night, I stared at the ledger on my kitchen table, wondering how much longer I could hold out. Then came the night that broke me and rebuilt me all at once. I woke to the sound of engines. My heart leapt as I rushed to the window. Under the pale wash of moonlight, I saw them, a line of trucks rumbling onto my land. No permission, no warning, just steel and arrogance tearing through the dark. I stormed outside, flashlight beam cutting across their faces. "Get off my property!" I roared, but they didn't stop. One bulldozer lowered its blade, chewing into the soil like it belonged to them. Rage surged hotter than I'd ever felt. I ran to the machine, slamming my fists against the metal. The operator finally cut the engine, leaning out of the cab with a smirk. "Court's gonna side with us anyway," he shouted. "Might as well get a head start." I stood there, chest heaving, fists clenched, the weight of a century pressing down on me. For a split second, I thought of giving up, letting them win, walking away. But then I looked around at the barns my great-grandfather built by hand, at the old oak where my parents carved their initials, at the fence posts I'd mended 100 times. This wasn't just land. This was blood, sweat, history. I didn't step aside. I stood right in front of that bulldozer, my flashlight beam fixed steady. The operator cursed, revved the engine, but he didn't move. Maybe he saw it in my eyes that I was ready to be crushed before I'd let him pass. They pulled out that night, grumbling, promising to be back with a court order. And maybe they would. But something had shifted. For the first time, I felt the power of standing my ground, not just in words, but in flesh and blood. Later, as the stars burned cold above me, I leaned on the fence and let the night air fill my lungs. I knew the war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But I also knew something else: they hadn't broken me yet. And the thing about a man who refuses to break is that he becomes far more dangerous than anyone ever expected. Everyone told me the bulldozers would come back, and they were right. But what no one warned me about was how much dirt they'd throw, not just onto my land, but onto my name. The following week, the local paper ran a headline: "Rancher stands in the way of progress." They painted me as some bitter old man clinging to the past, too stubborn to see the benefits this new road would bring. Benefits for who? The developers who sat in polished boardrooms, the county officials who'd lined their pockets with kickbacks. I read those words, my fists trembling, and realized they weren't just building a road anymore. They were building a story, one where I was the villain. I tried to shake it off, but the lies stuck. At the hardware store, I felt eyes on me. Conversations quieted when I walked in. Some neighbors I'd known for years started avoiding me altogether. It was as if the county had reached inside my own community and poisoned the well. And yet, a few people still believed in me. Quietly, behind closed doors, they slipped me envelopes with photos, documents, even recordings. Whispers of shady land deals, backroom meetings, developers buying influence. Each piece was like a puzzle, hinting that what I was up against was bigger than a simple road project. Kincaid, my lawyer, spread the evidence across his cluttered desk one night, his cigarette smoke curling into the lamplight. "They're scared," he muttered, tapping a photo of a county commissioner shaking hands with a developer. "Scared enough to smear you, scared enough to break the law themselves." Hope surged again. Maybe I wasn't crazy. Maybe this wasn't just about me. Maybe it was about exposing corruption that stretched further than anyone dared imagine. But the county wasn't about to let me control the narrative. A few days later, I came home to find my mailbox hanging open, its contents scattered in the dirt. Among the letters was another official notice, this one colder than all the rest. The county was filing for immediate possession of my land under eminent domain. No more waiting, no more court delays. They wanted me out now. The paper shook in my hands as I read it. My throat went dry. Immediate possession meant they could move in with the sheriff's backing and take everything while the lawsuits dragged on. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me. This wasn't a fight in some distant courtroom anymore. This was war, and they were bringing it right to my doorstep. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I walked the property line with a flashlight, boots crunching in the gravel, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the fields. Every fence post, every tree, every stretch of earth looked different under the moonlight, like they were whispering to me, "Don't let them take us." I thought of my grandfather again, the rifle slung across his shoulder in that faded photograph. He'd fought droughts, debt, and storms to keep this land standing. And now it was my turn to fight men in suits with pens sharper than any blade. The next morning I called Kincaid. My voice was firm. "We're not just defending anymore, we're going after them." He chuckled dryly, like he'd been waiting for me to say those words. "Then you better be ready to play offense." We filed counterclaims. We exposed conflicts of interest, and slowly the tide began to shift. Articles appeared in papers outside our county questioning the road project. A local radio station invited me to speak, and for the first time my voice carried further than the courthouse walls. I told them about the history, about 6 generations of sweat poured into that soil, about the greed hiding behind words like progress. The response shocked me. Letters poured in. People from towns I'd never visited wrote to say they understood. That they'd seen the same thing happen where they lived, that maybe it was time someone stood up and said no. But momentum didn't come without backlash. One evening I pulled into my driveway to find my barn doors swung wide open, tools scattered, fences cut, and painted across the side of the barn in dripping black letters were 2 words, "Give up." I stood frozen, the smell of spray paint heavy in the air, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a message, loud and clear. They wanted to break me from the inside out. I called the sheriff, but he shrugged it off as vandalism. No investigation, no protection, just a warning to stay quiet. That night, as I swept broken glass from the barn floor, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. The lawsuits, the lies, the threats. And for a brief, dangerous moment, I wondered if they were right. Maybe I couldn't win. Maybe I was just one man trying to dam a flood that would swallow me whole. But then my hand brushed against something buried under a tarp, my grandfather's old branding iron, rusted but still sharp at the edges. I lifted it, felt its weight, and remembered his words. Land isn't borrowed, it's guarded. I set the iron down and took a deep breath. They wanted me broken. They wanted me afraid. But what they didn't understand was that every blow they landed only hammered my resolve into steel. Because this wasn't just about dirt anymore. It was about dignity, about legacy. About proving that even when the odds are impossible, one voice refusing to be silenced can echo louder than an army of machines. And I knew then the next move would be mine. The morning I decided to fight back for real, the air felt heavier than usual. A storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in every corner of my life. I could feel it pressing on my chest, warning me that once I took this step, there'd be no turning back. Kincaid had warned me. When you go after powerful men, they don't fight fair. They'll dig up your past, twist your words, and hit you where it hurts most. I nodded when he said it, but I don't think I fully understood until it began. The first blow came quiet, subtle. A letter from the bank claiming I'd missed payments I knew I'd made. I combed through my records, receipts lined up in neat stacks on the kitchen table, but somehow the bank's version didn't match mine. Errors that weren't errors. Lost deposits that I knew had cleared. Someone had reached into my finances and muddied the waters, and they wanted me drowning before I even realized I was sinking. Then came the rumors, whispers that I was drinking too much, that I'd threatened county workers, that I was unstable. I'd walk into town and see the way people looked at me, not as the rancher they'd known all their lives, but as a ticking time bomb. The lies spread faster than I could swat them down, and I realized the county wasn't just fighting me in court anymore. They were fighting me in the court of public opinion. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the power went out at the ranch. Not for an hour, not for a day, for a week. Calls to the utility company went unanswered. Meanwhile, I saw lights burning bright on every other property along the ridge. They were trying to squeeze me, choke me out, make me too tired to keep swinging. But pressure doesn't always break a man. Sometimes it forges him. That's when I started keeping a journal. Each night by the light of a kerosene lamp, I wrote everything down. Dates, names, what I saw, what I heard. Every shady maneuver, every threat, every scrap of evidence slipped to me by those who still dared to help. It became my weapon, a record of the truth that no smear campaign could erase. And truth has a way of finding its moment. One afternoon, Kincaid called me into his office. His eyes were sharp, more alive than I'd ever seen them. He slapped a document onto the desk. "They slipped up," he said. It was a contract between the county and a private developer, signed weeks before the public vote to approve the road. Proof that the whole project had been a sham from the start, that the progress they preached about was nothing more than a cash grab dressed in legal clothes. I felt my chest tighten as I stared at the page. For months, I'd felt like I was screaming into the void, telling anyone who'd listen that this wasn't just about a road. And now, here it was, cold, hard proof. We took it to court, filing motions, demanding investigations, and suddenly the tone shifted. Reporters showed up at hearings. Cameras flashed as I walked out of the courthouse. Strangers shook my hand, whispering, "Keep going, don't let them win." But with visibility came danger. Late one night, as I drove home, headlights flared in my rearview mirror. A truck, high beams blinding me, riding my bumper on the dark county road. I slowed, it slowed. I sped up, it sped up. My pulse hammered as I gripped the wheel, the narrow gravel shoulders offering no escape. Then, just as suddenly, the truck swerved into the oncoming lane, roaring past me with a blast of its horn before disappearing into the night. My hands shook on the steering wheel. It wasn't an accident, it was a warning. The next morning, I found tire tracks in my pasture, deep ruts tearing through the soil where someone had driven circles under cover of darkness. A violation, plain and deliberate. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me broken. But fear had long since burned into resolve. Standing in that pasture, the wind tugging at my shirt, I whispered to the land, "They're coming for you, but I'm not done fighting." Kincaid and I prepared for the next hearing like soldiers readying for battle. The contract was our weapon, the proof we needed to cut through their polished lies. As I stepped into the courthouse, the weight of history pressed on me. My grandfather's words, my father's sweat, my own sleepless nights, all of it leading here. The county's lawyers strutted in, their smugness unshaken, but I could see something different in their eyes, a flicker of doubt. For the first time, they weren't the only ones holding the cards. That hearing dragged on for hours. Legal jargon flew like bullets, objections rising and falling, judges leaning in, brows furrowed. But every time they tried to spin the story, Kincaid slammed them with the contract, with evidence of deals made in back rooms before the people ever had a say. When the gavel finally fell, no decision was reached, but the damage was done. The judge ordered an investigation. The road was halted, temporarily at least. I walked out of that courtroom into the glare of cameras, microphones shoved toward me, questions shouted in rapid fire. My throat tightened, but I forced the words out steady. This isn't about one ranch. This is about the truth, and the truth is finally coming to light. That night back at the ranch, I stood on the porch staring at the stars. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't dared to feel before. Not fear, not anger. Hope. But deep down, I knew this was only the middle of the story. Because when powerful men are cornered, they don't surrender. They strike back harder. The night after the hearing, sleep wouldn't come. The silence of the ranch felt heavier, thicker, as if the air itself was waiting for something. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the sound came faint at first, then louder. Tires crunching on gravel, headlights sweeping across the walls of my bedroom. I grabbed the shotgun leaning by the door and stepped out onto the porch. The night was black, the kind of dark where even the stars felt smothered. Down by the gate, 2 trucks idled, engines low and menacing. I couldn't make out faces, only the glow of cigarettes, the glint of chrome under the moon. For a long moment, no one moved, just the engines growling, my heart pounding. Then, as if on cue, both trucks revved and tore away, gravel spitting, dust clouds hanging in the air long after they vanished. It wasn't a visit, it was a message. By morning, I found the rest of their message carved into the dirt of my pasture, the road's route, etched by tire tracks across land that hadn't yet been touched. They were telling me, this is happening whether you like it or not. I called the sheriff, again. He came out, scribbled in a notepad, and gave me the same half-hearted shrug. Probably just kids messing around, he said, but we both knew better. Kincaid wasn't surprised when I told him. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. They're tightening the noose. Expect worse before it gets better. And worse came fast. A week later, I was served again, this time with charges of endangering public safety. According to their papers, I had blocked county workers, threatened them with violence, and created hazardous conditions around the site. Lies, every word, but they didn't care. They weren't trying to win truth. They were trying to bury me in it. The news picked it up, spinning the story into something twisted. Local TV anchors asked if I was a danger to the community. Editorials called me reckless, irresponsible, a relic of the past standing in the way of progress. For the first time, doubt crept into my bones. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, my reflection in the cold coffee staring back like a stranger. My phone buzzed with messages I didn't want to read, family telling me to give it up, friends urging me to settle, neighbors distancing themselves one by one. And then the unthinkable happened. The county froze my accounts. With one stroke of a pen, they cut off my access to the money I needed to survive. No gas for the truck, no feed for the cattle, no way to keep fighting without selling the very land I was trying to save. I broke that night. For the first time since this battle began, I felt myself unravel. I walked the property in the dark, my boots dragging through the dust, tears stinging my eyes. The weight of 6 generations pressed down, heavier than I could carry. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," I whispered into the wind. "I don't know if I can hold on anymore." The wind didn't answer. The land stayed silent. But silence has a way of revealing things. I ended up in the barn, slumped against the wall, staring at the old branding iron again. And slowly, through the fog of despair, I remembered something my grandmother used to say when storms came rolling in. The night always feels longest right before the dawn. I closed my eyes, breathing deep, and somewhere in that moment, resolve came back to me. If they wanted me starved, silenced, erased, fine. But they couldn't erase the truth, and truth, once it finds daylight, can burn hotter than any lie. The very next morning, I loaded boxes into the bed of my truck, my journals, the evidence, every scrap of paper and photo I'd collected. If they thought cutting off my money would stop me, they'd forgotten something more valuable, my voice. I drove 3 hours to the city where bigger papers and bigger cameras waited. I walked into a newsroom, slammed the boxes on the editor's desk, and said, "You want a story? Here's one. A county destroying a ranch to feed developers, a man they're trying to bury alive. You print this and you'll see what they're scared of." The editor stared at me like I'd dropped dynamite in his office. Then he leaned forward, flipping through the files, his eyes widening. "My God," he whispered, "you've got them." The first article ran a week later. Not a smear, not a county press release. The truth. Headlines screamed corruption, backroom deals, greed disguised as progress. Pictures of my ranch, my family history, the contracts they tried to hide. And for the first time, the county wasn't in control of the story. But victories like that are double-edged. The same night the article went live, I heard gunshots in the distance. Not close enough to hit anything, but close enough to hear. A warning, sharp and deliberate. My cattle spooked, scattering in the fields. My pulse hammered as I gripped the shotgun, scanning the dark horizon. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for land anymore. I was fighting for survival. And yet, under the fear, something else stirred. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the ground shift in my favor. People were finally seeing what I saw, hearing what I shouted into the void for months. The county could smear me, starve me, threaten me, but the truth was out now. And once truth is out, it spreads like wildfire. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still ahead. Because men who build empires on lies don't just roll over when the walls start cracking. They fight to the bitter end. The morning after the article hit, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, activists, neighbors who had once turned their backs, suddenly everyone wanted to talk. My story had bled out of the shadows and into living rooms, onto headlines, across radio waves. For the first time, I wasn't just the man screaming into the void. I was the man people wanted to hear. But power doesn't crumble quietly. By midday, the county struck back. They called a press conference, wheeling out their polished smiles and manicured lies. Standing in front of a banner that read "Community Progress," they painted me as the villain, a bitter landowner clinging to the past, sabotaging growth, endangering workers. They paraded fake statistics, doctored photos, even testimonies from so-called witnesses who claimed I had threatened them with weapons. Watching from my kitchen table, fists clenched, I felt the anger boiling hot enough to burn through me. "Liars," I muttered to the empty room. "Every last one of you." But then, something unexpected. A reporter stood up, holding my documents, the ones I'd handed over just days before. She looked the county commissioner dead in the eye and asked, "If your claims are true, then how do you explain these contracts, signed months before you claimed the project was approved? And why are the signatures of ranchers already marked with disputes?" For the first time, their smiles faltered, their voices cracked, they dodged, they stumbled. And in that hesitation, I saw it, the first real crack in their armor. That night, the ranch wasn't silent. Trucks lined the dirt road, not menacing this time, but supportive. Neighbors, farmers, townsfolk, some I hadn't spoken to in years. They brought food, feed, even cash tucked in envelopes. One man pressed my hand and whispered, "You're not fighting alone anymore." I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd carried this battle like a boulder strapped to my chest. And now, for the first time, it felt lighter, not gone, but shared. Still, support comes with risk. Because days later, retaliation took a sharper edge. The county pushed construction crews onto my land without notice, bulldozers roaring like beasts at dawn. They smashed through fences, tearing apart soil my grandfather had plowed with his own hands. I ran to the gate, shouting, waving papers, screaming that it was illegal. But the workers looked past me, eyes hard, motions mechanical. They weren't listening. They weren't allowed to listen. By the time the sheriff arrived, hours later, the damage was done. Acres ripped open, cattle scattered, dust clouds choking the sky. The sheriff scribbled in his book again, shaking his head like a man already defeated. But something inside me refused to bend. I went live that night, me, the man who hated cameras, standing under a single bulb in my barn, telling the world what happened. No script, no polish, just truth, raw and jagged. My voice cracked, my hands shook, but I told them everything. About the bulldozers, the lies, the way they wanted me broken. And the world listened. The video spread faster than I ever imagined. Strangers from other states messaged me. Veterans, ranchers, single mothers, even city folk who'd never set foot on dirt but understood the sting of being crushed by power. Donations poured in. Offers of legal help doubled, tripled. The county had thrown everything at me, and instead of burying me, they'd exposed themselves. But victory wasn't safe yet. Because soon after, I found out something chilling. The county had filed emergency eminent domain. A judge, one tied to developers through campaign money, had already signed off. If it held, they could seize the land immediately, with no trial, no chance for me to defend it. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, I felt the knife twist. All the support, the articles, the evidence, it wouldn't matter if the law itself had already been bought. I stared out the window at the dark fields, the cattle barely visible in the moonlight, the barn standing stubborn against the wind. "Is this where it ends?" I whispered. Not in a blaze, not in truth, but in paperwork. I wanted to believe the answer was no. And then, like a spark, I remembered the box under my bed. Inside were letters. Old letters, written by my great-grandfather to the state when the ranch was first chartered. Deeds signed by governors, sealed with ink so old it had faded to brown. Contracts guaranteeing this land belonged to us in perpetuity. I pulled them out with trembling hands, scanning each word, each seal, each line. And there it was, language no one had thought to check. Protections written before the county even existed. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, but enough. Because maybe, just maybe, the land itself had been waiting for me to find the key. The next morning, I marched into Kincaid's office, the old papers in my arms. He leaned forward as I dropped them on his desk, his eyes narrowing, then widening. He flipped page after page, muttering under his breath. Finally, he looked up, a slow grin spreading across his face. "They thought they had you," he said, "but you've got something they never saw coming. This changes everything." The county thought they had buried me under their lies. But buried things have a way of growing roots. And those roots were about to crack concrete. The courthouse was packed the morning of the hearing. Reporters lined the steps, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now stood shoulder to shoulder, holding handmade signs, "Protect the ranch, stop the corruption, truth matters." Inside, the air was thick with tension. The county's lawyers sat smug, their suits pressed sharp enough to cut glass, their binders stacked like walls around them. Across the aisle, I sat with Kincaid and the old box of documents at my feet. My hands shook as I rested them on the lid, feeling the weight of history pressing against my palms. The judge walked in, the same one rumored to be bought and paid for, and the gavel slammed. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The county went first, their arguments flowing smooth and polished. They spoke of progress, safety, public good. They painted me as the lone obstacle, a stubborn relic standing in the way of growth. Every sentence felt like a dagger, and for a moment I wondered if all the truth in the world could stand against power this polished, this prepared. And then it was our turn. Kincaid spoke with fire, his voice low but unshakable. He showed the contracts, the lies, the photos of bulldozers ripping through my land. The courtroom murmured, gasps rising as the pieces fit together. And then, slowly, he turned to me. "Tell them," he said. The room went still. I stood, my knees weak, my throat dry. For a moment, all I could hear was my own heartbeat, hammering like a war drum. And then I spoke, not as a lawyer, not as a politician, but as a man whose blood ran in the soil of that ranch. I told them about my great-grandfather, breaking ground with nothing but calloused hands. About my grandmother, who rode out storms with faith that dawn always came. About my father, who taught me that dignity isn't inherited, it's fought for, earned, protected. I told them about the night trucks came to my gate, about the lies, the threats, the way they tried to starve me out. And then I placed the old papers on the bench, my hands trembling but firm. "These," I said, my voice cracking, "are older than every man sitting in this room, older than the county itself. They prove what I've known my whole life, that this land isn't just dirt, isn't just acreage. It's protected, promised, ours." The judge's face gave nothing away. He took the papers, leafing through them slowly, too slowly, the room holding its breath. The county lawyers shifted, whispers hissing like snakes. And then something happened. The judge leaned back, adjusted his glasses, and cleared his throat. "It appears," he said, each word deliberate, "that the county has overlooked binding agreements that supersede their claim, agreements that make this seizure unlawful." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. My chest tightened, breath catching as if the weight of generations lifted in a single second. But the judge wasn't finished. His voice grew harder, sharper. Furthermore, evidence presented shows a pattern of misrepresentation and abuse of process by county officials. This court cannot and will not allow such actions to stand. The gavel slammed again. The petition for eminent domain is denied, effective immediately. For a heartbeat, the world froze, and then it erupted. Reporters shouted, neighbors cheered, strangers clapped me on the back. Kincaid grinned so wide I thought his face might split. My knees buckled, and I gripped the bench to steady myself, tears stinging my eyes. I had done it. No, we had done it. The land was safe. But victory never comes without scars. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed. Reporters demanded sound bites. Neighbors shook my hand like I was a war hero. But when the crowd thinned, I stood alone on the steps, staring at the sky. The ranch was waiting. When I drove back that evening, the sunset painted the land in fire, gold, crimson, purple. The fields were torn, fences broken, soil scarred. But it was mine, still mine. And as I stepped out of the truck, the cattle began to wander back, cautious but steady, as if they knew the fight was over. I walked to the old branding iron one last time, picking it up from where it leaned against the barn. It felt different in my hand now. Not just a reminder of history, but proof that history had carried me through. Neighbors arrived that night with hammers, wood, nails. Together, we rebuilt the fence under the stars. Each board placed felt like defiance, like resurrection. And as laughter and voices carried across the dark, I realized something. The county had tried to break me by isolating me. But in the end, they'd given me back something I didn't even know I'd lost. Community. The fight had nearly destroyed me, but it had also reminded me of a truth buried deep in the land itself. You don't own the earth, you belong to it. And sometimes belonging means standing so stubbornly, so defiantly, that power has no choice but to break against you. So I recently went through a battle that almost cost me everything. They built a road through my ranch. They sued me for trying to stop them. They tried to starve me, smear me, silence me. But the land, it remembers who fights for it. And in the end, the land chose me. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.